Do I say good morning or good evening? Good night. So used to saying good morning. It's good to see everybody. We have a number of visitors with us tonight, so we welcome you especially. If you're looking for restrooms, it's kind of a small facility. You'll eventually find it, but they're basically behind that block wall there, and you just follow the hallway along that line, and you should be able to end up there pretty well. We have two sessions tonight at 7 o'clock. And then again at 8 o'clock, there'll be Q&A afterwards. If you got a question, we have somebody who will be walking around with the microphone to hand it to you so that those who are, we're recording tonight and we're also live streaming. So for the benefit of those who are not able to attend, can hear the questions, we'll be passing that around. And then tomorrow morning, we'll be meeting at 8:45, kind of like a Sunday school hour from 8:45 to 9:45. Then our service starts at 10. And Dr. Kruger will be our guest speaker for the sermon tomorrow as well. So we're going to make the most of this opportunity we have with him, and we appreciate him coming. And actually, I want to have Denny come at this time and give it like a formal introduction so we can appreciate the standing this man has to speak on the subjects that he's going to be talking about.
Well, that could take all night. We're happy to have Dr. Kruger with us. He is, if I get this right, Samuel C. Patterson Chancellor's Professor of New Testament Studies and Early Christianity. It's a lengthy title, you know. I should have written it in the palm of my hand. He's written a number of books. Many of you are familiar with several of his books. We've done in groups here Heresy of Orthodoxy, and I think I did one on the canon revisited at one time. But he's written a whole host of material dealing with early Christianity, the development of the canon, textual criticism. And he's done recently a book called Religion 101, preparing your kids to go off to school and face the sort of challenges they're going to get in their standard college challenges to Christianity. When he went to University of North Carolina, I think he encountered an unknown Bart Ehrman at that time. And at the other end, he took his doctorate from underneath Larry Hurtado, and many of you are familiar with Hurtado's work. Fascinating stuff to read if you haven't read any of it. So he's going to be speaking on the development of the canon, and we're very happy to have him here. So let's give him a round of applause.
Well, good evening, everybody. Great to see you. Thanks for coming out tonight. Thank you for that introduction, Denny. I just got off the plane like an hour and a half ago. In fact, we were just joking on the way in. We're thinking that we hope that flight's on time. I was at another event. I was telling them at the University of Arkansas just a week or two ago, and when I showed up, the flight was not on time. And as a result, I had to put on the microphone in the car on the way to the event. And I'm in the front seat, getting it all ready to go, and out of the car on the stage, speaking right away. So at least I had an hour and a half to catch my breath here. So we got a chance to grab dinner and get a little bit oriented before we got to dive into today's material. But it's a thrill to be with you. I'm excited about the weekend, excited about the topics before us. As was mentioned, the overall theme of the weekend is well known. We're going to be talking about why we can trust the Bible and why it's something that is reliable and worthy of our belief and assent. But what I'm going to do this weekend is actually going to divide that up into little small chunks for you. And so I'm going to look at sort of what I think are three of the biggest objections to the Bible's reliability. And we'll just take those one at a time. And then we'll end the weekend, or at least my part of the weekend tomorrow, at the sermon. And what are the three biggest objections that you'll come across? Well, I think they're obvious, but we'll see them in the order of my talks. The first one's going to be sort of the historicity of the Bible and whether it's historically trustworthy. And we'll be looking at the Gospels in particular about that. And then secondly, we'll talk about the transmission of the Bible, whether it's been reliably copied, passed down by scribes over time. Has it been corrupted? Has it been changed? Has it been edited? That's really the second major objection. And then in the morning, for those of you who are able to come for the Sunday school class at 8:45, we're going to be talking about the canon of the Bible even more narrowly, and who collected these books, and why were they put together, and who did it, and when did it happen, and can that process be trusted as well? So basically, it's biblical reliability, biblical transmission, biblical canon. Those are the big three. And then I'll be preaching in the service tomorrow on Hebrews chapter 4 about the Word of God being living and active. So it's an exciting chance to dive into these really important topics. I'm thrilled you're able to come out tonight, and hopefully you'll be able to come out tomorrow. Also, let me mention this, and it was said in the introduction, we're going to have some time for Q&A tonight. This is actually one of my favorite parts, because I don't want to merely have you hear from me. I want to hear from you. What's on your mind? What are you wondering about? What is tickling in the back of your mind in terms of the trustworthiness of the Bible? And so you'll have a chance to interact with my material tonight when we deal with Q&A on both of the two talks. And then, of course, I'll be up here individually afterwards for further conversation if you want to do that. Okay, that's our plan. Let's dive into the first of those tonight, which has to do with the reliability of the Scriptures, in particular the reliability of the Gospels. And to kick off our first session, I actually want to start in a rather unusual spot, probably a spot you would not expect, because I want to begin by talking about Muhammad Ali. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, that's the weirdest start ever to a talk on the origins of the Bible. Why are we talking about Muhammad Ali? Well, we're not actually talking about Muhammad Ali the boxer. I want to talk about Muhammad Ali the shepherd, probably a Muhammad Ali you've never heard of or thought of before. But in 1945, Muhammad Ali the shepherd, a little town in Upper Egypt called Nag Hammadi, made what might be one of the greatest archaeological discoveries of the modern world. In fact, believe it or not, just on the plane today, on the way here, I was reading in a book that was articulating this discovery and said, yes, this might be the greatest archaeological discovery in the modern world. What did Muhammad Ali find? Well, one day he was out in his field. He was a shepherd. He was a farmer. He was digging in the ground for this certain soil that would have been useful for fertilizer with his brother. And his shovel hit something hard. And then he began to clear away the dirt and discovered something that was something like out of a movie. He found an old earthenware jar. And he began to wonder what was inside of it. So he was about to break it open, thinking maybe there's jewels or gold or silver or treasure, which would make any sort of poor shepherd's life change dramatically. And about the moment he's about to break it open, his brother stops and goes, wait a second, maybe there's an evil genie inside that'll curse us. So they have a big conversation about evil genies, and they debate this back and forth, and finally they decide, okay, we're going to risk the evil genie, we're going to break open this jar, and so they break it open. And when they do so, they're profoundly disappointed, because there's no jewels, no gold, no treasure. All that's in the jar are books. And if he were to have counted them, he would have realized actually there were 13 of these books, 13 what we call leather-bound codices, in which were multiple stories. In fact, 52 different stories inside those codices, all about Jesus. And he had discovered not just stories of Jesus, but stories of Jesus that up to that point no one had really ever heard before and never really had been discovered before. And the Jesus in these books, if only Muhammad Ali had realized it, told a very different story of the Gospels that you and I are familiar with. We think of Jesus as one who's the divine Son of God, but in these books, it's not so much that Jesus is divine, but that you and I can be divine. And if you read these books, it's not so much that you're saved from sin or from trespasses. If you read these books, you're really saved from lack of enlightenment and that you just need to have some higher form of knowledge. What Muhammad Ali had found was what later became known as the Gnostic Gospels. Now, if only he had known, because he ended up selling it to an antiquities dealer, who sold it to another antiquities dealer, who sold it to another antiquities dealer, and only till later down the road they realized, oh my goodness, he has found basically a lost collection of stories of Jesus. And inside those Gnostic Gospels was one particular gospel that became the most famous. It's probably one that you've heard of, and some of you may have even read at some point, known as the Gospel of Thomas. Muhammad Ali, the shepherd, made what is arguably one of the greatest archaeological discoveries in the modern age. Why? What was so special about it? Well, when scholars found these books, they began to ask the same questions that probably you're asking even tonight as you hear the story, which is, well, what do you do with lost stories of Jesus anyway? And why do these not make it into our Bible? And by the way, who decided what books go in our Bible? And why should we trust Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as opposed to, say, the Gospel of Thomas anyway. And by the way, weren't there other Gospels beside the Gospel of Thomas? Wasn't there the Gospel of Philip and the Gospel of Mary and the Gospel of Peter and the Gospel of Judas and all these other Gospels? And why would we think our Gospels are anything special? And what if things had gone differently in history and we'd ended up with other Gospels in our Bible? Aren't they all pretty much the same anyway? Those are very big questions. Because whichever gospel you trust and read is going to tell you what Jesus you should know and believe in. So a different gospel means a different Jesus. And that's really what's at stake in this whole discussion. And that's really what changed the landscape of the study of the Gospels upon that discovery of Muhammad Ali. Now, here's what I want to do in our first session tonight. I want to basically deal with why our Gospels are in our New Testaments as opposed to Gospels like the Gospel of Thomas. I want to ask the question, is there any reason why Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John made it in our Bibles as opposed to these other texts? Are these other texts just as valid? Are they just as good? Are they just as important? Do they tell us true things about Jesus? And maybe we wish we had those in our Bibles. That will be our topic for tonight. So basically tonight I'm going to give you what would be called sort of a miniature case, a small apologetic for Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John and why they're special. And of course I'm going to make the case that they actually ended up in our Bibles for a reason, that they're not arbitrary, they're not randomly there, they're not just the choice of some political faction within early Christianity, but that actually there's a real common sense historical reasons why we ended up with these Gospels in our Bibles as opposed to something like the Gospel of Thomas. Now that's our goal in this first session. Before we jump into that formally though, I want to step back for a moment. And I actually want to ask a more broad question when we think about the story of Muhammad Ali and the Gospel of Thomas. And then and that question is, why is it that our world is so fascinated with lost Gospels anyway? I think that's important to ponder for a moment, because I think once we answer that question, it's actually going to set the stage for our discussion about what makes our Gospels important and what makes them distinctive and unique. Now, you may not have thought much about it, but actually it is true that our world is fascinated with lost Gospels. There's so many titles out there now about lost Gospels, forgotten scriptures, lost Bibles, all with the theme of some hidden secret text that's now been discovered, and now you can know what Jesus is really like. And if you write a book about a lost gospel, you're bound to sell lots of copies. And if you write a book about our Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you'll probably sell a lot less copies. I actually happen to know this because I write about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and not about the Gospel of Thomas. And I can tell you that if I were to write about these other Gospels, I'm sure I'd sell a lot more copies of my books. Every once in a while I think to myself, maybe I should just write a story about the Gospel of Thomas and sell a lot of books, and then later say, just kidding, that's not really what I wanted to write about anyway. But regardless, what you realize is our world is absolutely mesmerized by this sense that maybe we've been misguided this whole time, and that maybe now we're finally learning what Jesus is really like. What is it about that question that grips people's imaginations? I want to suggest to you that it's not random that the stories of lost Gospels have proved so fascinating in our postmodern age. If you don't know anything about the current cultural moment we live in, it's often known as postmodernity, which comes after modernity. And if you think about it, modernity was an age where everyone wanted to prove things by science and by facts and by historical arguments. And then the postmodern world came around and said, wait a second. In postmodernity, there's a recognition that there's so much disagreement about theology and philosophy, about God and the Bible and about truth, that what postmodern people like to talk about is the diversity of views out there, the diversity of opinions about every issue you could possibly talk about. And usually there's a lot of discussion about how many different religions there are and how many different perspectives there are and how many different philosophical takes there are. And by the way, that's true. There are a lot of religions. There are a lot of opinions, and there are a lot of philosophical takes. But what you'll notice about postmodern sort of individuals and postmodern people is they don't just merely observe the existence of intellectual diversity, they draw a conclusion from it. And it's actually that second step that we don't notice. It's not merely look at all the different religious views. It's not merely look at all the different philosophical views. A conclusion is drawn from that, and that conclusion is one you hear all the time, which is if there's so much differences of opinion about religion, then no one view could possibly be right. It's that second step that is often made and slipped into the argument in a way that is not ever justified. Everyone agrees there's lots of philosophical opinions. Does it follow from that not one view could possibly be right? Well, according to postmodern people, yes, that's exactly the point. By the way, you can see how important that is for our discussion of lost gospels. There's so many different gospels out there. There's so many different views of Jesus out there. There's so many approaches to who Jesus was out there, then no one gospel could possibly be right. No one gospel is any better than any other. Now, there's a scholar that famously made that argument many years ago, and you probably never heard his name. In 1934, a German scholar by the name of Walter Bauer wrote a very famous book called Orthodoxy and Heresy in Early Christianity. And in 1934, when Bauer wrote that book, no one noticed. It was totally lost in obscurity, and the reasons are not hard to discover because in 1934, in Germany, no one was talking about Walter Bauer. In 1934, everyone was talking about this other guy named Adolf Hitler, and so he wrote his book and no one noticed. But then in 1971, it was translated into English. And suddenly everyone in the academic space began to take notice of this book. And you know what Bauer argued? He basically argued that when you look back in early Christianity, there's no such thing as early Christianity. In fact, he said that all you have in the early phases of the church are early Christianities, plural. All these different versions of the faith, all claiming to be original, all claiming to be genuine, all claiming to be orthodox, all very different from each other, all having a big theological battle about who really is the original version of Christianity and who is actually the right version of Christianity. So there's not just one version, according to Bauer. There's many versions. And then on top of that, Bauer says, and each of these different versions of Christianity have their own gospels. They have their own books. And you know why you have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in your Bibles? Not because they're any better than any other gospels, argues Bauer, but because they happen to be the books that preferred by the group that prevailed, the group that won, the group that succeeded and conquered all the other groups, theologically speaking, and became the dominant version of Christianity. In other words, according to Bauer, the reason we read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John is just an arbitrary accident of history. It's just the random occurrence of events. If another group had won, you wouldn't be reading Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. You'd be reading Thomas, Mary, and Philip. And you wouldn't even know the difference. To put it more succinctly, Bauer's argument is that all gospels are the same. That none are better or worse than any others. And that you happen to read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but there's nothing about them that makes them any different than any other gospel. Now, that whole backstory I just gave you, which is how this debate fits into our postmodern age, is the story you will have heard if you're taking any major religion class. I wrote a book a few years ago that Denny mentioned called Surviving Religion 101. It's actually for college students. And I mentioned that in the book, which is you're going to hear this narrative that all gospels are the same. There's none better than another. Don't prejudice by saying one's right and one's wrong. They're all just equally valid. Could have been Gospel of Thomas, could have been the Gospel of John. There's no differences between them. Now, that story, that narrative plays really well in a postmodern world. And I suppose if you don't ever examine it, it sounds pretty persuasive. Maybe Gospels all are the same. Maybe there's no real reason why we should think that ours are better than anybody else's. But that narrative only works if you don't look at the historical facts. If you look at the historical evidence, you quickly discover that actually there are very good reasons why Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are in our Bibles as opposed to other Gospels. So that brings us back to the point of our first talk, which is I want to give you those reasons. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to lay out 4 reasons for you for why our Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, what we call the canonical Gospels, actually have made their way into our Bibles for very good reasons. These are 4 things that set our Gospels apart from every other Gospel out there. Now, when I say there's 4 reasons, I'm not suggesting there's only 4. Actually, there's many more that I'm going to mention for you tonight. But these are 4 reasons I think you can wrap your minds around, 4 reasons that you can grasp, 4 reasons you can take away. My hope is, of course, that as you hear these 4 reasons, you think to yourself, okay, I personally now know I have a reason I can trust these books. Okay, that's good. But my hope is not merely that you personally take something away. My hope also is that these 4 sort of talking points, if you will, can be things you can bring up to somebody if you ever get in a conversation with them and they say, well, what makes the Gospels in our Bible any better than any others? And you can say, well, I at least have something to say now in response to that. Okay, 4 things that set our Gospels apart. Let's take these one at a time. And here's the first. Our Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are the earliest Gospels we have. They are the earliest Gospels we have. Here's the thing that is true for all historians of antiquity. All of historians of antiquity realize if you want to know what happened in the ancient world, there's really only one way to know. Somewhere, someone wrote things down. It's just that simple. You can learn a little bit from archaeology, and I'm not suggesting you can't learn anything from archaeology, but in terms of the particulars of a person's life and what they did and what they said and what they were like in various ways, the only reason you know anything about anyone in all of ancient history is because someone, somewhere, wrote it down. That's what history is. There are words written down about what took place. We have thousands of historical documents about countless events in the ancient world. But when historians evaluate these historical documents, there's always something they want. They want to find a historical document that was written as close as possible to the events it's purporting to record. This is just common sense history. If you have an event and someone wrote down what happened in that event, you want the thing that was written down to have been written down at a time as close as possible to the events it's purporting to record. That's true for any document of antiquity, it's true for any event in the ancient world, and it's also true for the Gospels. So if Jesus lived in the first century, which he did, and we want to know what Jesus said and did and what he was like, wouldn't you want documents that were written in the very century in which Jesus lived? Or put it another way, wouldn't you want Gospels that come from the first century? Certainly that is common sense, and if you were to create your sort of ideal gospel, you'd want a gospel from the time in which Jesus lived. Not a later century, but the very century in which he did these things. Think about it for a moment. Let's imagine that you had a gospel that was, say, from the 4th century. What if someone wrote a gospel in the 4th century and says, let me tell you all about Jesus? You might think to yourself, okay, I suppose that person can get some things right. I guess it's possible they could record some things accurately. But if someone's writing in the 4th century, you think to yourself, well, what do you know in the 4th century anyway? And if I were comparing a gospel that was written in the 4th century from a gospel written in the 1st century, wouldn't I not think, at least all else being equal, that I'd rather take the gospel from the 1st century? Well, let me tell you this. If you want a gospel written in the century in which Jesus lived, there's only actually 4 options for you: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And here's what's remarkable about this. There is a consensus now in modern scholarship that these are the only gospels that date from the 1st century, and that all of them date in the 1st century. Now, there's some disagreement over the particularities. You know, we have everything from Mark written possibly in the 50s, some would say 60s, but everyone agrees Mark was probably first. Everyone agrees John was probably last, somewhere in the 80s, maybe early 90s. Regardless of the way you map it out, everybody pretty much agrees now that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were written in the 1st century at some point. And more than that, no other Gospels other than those 4 are written in the 1st century. I can tell you this, in the field of biblical scholarship, a consensus is not easy to get. You take 4 scholars and stick them in a room, you get 4 views about just about everything. And by the way, there didn't used to be a consensus about this. If you go back 100 years, there used to be all kinds of ideas that maybe John was a late gospel and in the 2nd century, and who knows about these other dates. But as more and more evidence has poured in, scholars have been more and more convinced, no, that these are the gospels, are the earliest ones we have. And every once in a while, a scholar will try to challenge this. They'll try to say, no, maybe there's another gospel besides our gospels that are from the 1st century. And usually it's the gospel of Thomas. Our friend Muhammad Ali discovered that gospel. And they think, well, maybe Thomas is 1st century. So they'll publish a book arguing that Thomas is 1st century, and the scholarly community looks at it and says, all right, let's have a look. And no, we don't believe that. We're not persuaded by that. And by the way, that's not just conservative scholars. That's not just evangelical scholars. That's scholars of all stripes pretty much reached a consensus that the earliest gospels we have are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now, if that's true, let me just draw out a couple implications from it before we leave this first point. First, and I think I've already sort of made this point, which is that One implication, obviously, is that if you want to know something about Jesus, you want to get as close to these events as you possibly can from the person who wrote them. And if you want that, then the only options you really have are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And that is just a rule of thumb of all history. But there's another implication that I think is often overlooked in this discussion, and one worth noting here. And this doesn't often dawn on people. But here's the implication. If, in fact, our Gospels are written in the first century, which they were, that means they were written at a time when there were people still alive that had seen these things and had observed these things and had been there. In other words, they wrote at a time when there's people still around that had actually been a part of these historical events. And they could have said, yes, that's how it happened, or no, that's not how it happened. They could have confirmed or denied it. And if you were just fabricating the gospel and making things up, and you wrote that gospel at a time when there were people still around who were there, there's no way your gospel would have gotten out of the gate. Now, of course, someone could say, oh, but that's in the ancient world. People believed anything that was written down. You might think, oh, everyone in the ancient world was gullible. No one thought about what counts as good history in the ancient world. People just believed whatever was on the page. Really? Because when we look at the historical facts, that also doesn't bear itself out. Actually, you might be surprised to know that ancient historians were very picky and very particular about what counts as good history. And they would often critique their fellow historians and fellow historical accounts if they recorded bad history. And one of the things that made something bad history is that you did not interview eyewitnesses, you did not talk to people who were really there, you did not write at a time that was close to the events you're purporting to record. The idea that our Gospels could have been as successful as they were, written in the first century, when in fact there were people alive that could have contradicted them if they were made up, simply doesn't hold. Now, this first point then is quite compelling. If someone asks you what's different about your Gospels, you can simply say, well, I'm no biblical scholar, but I know one thing. These Gospels get you closer to the historical Jesus than any other Gospels we have. It's almost like I could stop there. It's like a one-point message. When's the last time you heard a one-point sermon, right? Where's our pastor here? Yeah, okay. Yeah, maybe next week you could preach a one-point sermon. People wouldn't know what to do with themselves, right? It's like no one has a one-point sermon, but in theory you could have a one-point message. You say, look, I don't know a lot about the Gospels, but thank you very much. I'll take the ones that get me closer to the historical Jesus than every other one. They're the only Gospels that get us to the first century. And this is one of the hallmark distinctives of them. Okay, let's move on to a second thing that makes our Gospels distinctive. And that's not just the when question, but now the who question. Who are the authors of these Gospels? You see, it's one thing to have a Gospel that's early, which we do, but it's another thing to have a Gospel written by somebody who has some sort of standing and some sort of access to the things that Jesus said and did. And so here's the second thing that sets our Gospels apart. Our Gospels are the only ones that have a credible connection to the apostles. They're the only Gospels that have a credible connection to the apostles. I want you to think about biographies for a moment. You've probably been in a bookstore and checked out a biography every now and then, or a library, and you maybe noticed that if it's a famous individual, there's lots of biographies written by lots of people about famous individuals. Let's imagine, for example, you wanted to have a biography of Nelson Mandela. So you wanted to know, okay, what was the story of Nelson Mandela? How did he come up, rise through power, his time in prison, his political career, et cetera, et cetera. If you went to the average bookstore, you'd find lots of options to get biographies on Nelson Mandela. But if you looked hard enough, eventually you'd find one with a little phrase on the front. And it would say, authorized biography. I don't know if you've ever reflected on that before. What's an authorized biography? Well, obviously, when it comes to someone's life who's famous, anybody could pick up a pen and write about it. That's actually not that distinctive. That happens a lot. But an authorized biography is different because an authorized biography is a situation where the person who's under discussion is actually given someone access to tell their story. Maybe giving them some behind-the-scenes information, giving them access to the archives, access to what happened. And most likely the person who's got the authorized biography is one who's been there and seen these things take place and has some standing to write about them. If you're looking for such a biography about Nelson Mandela, you could find one. It's written by Anthony Sampson, one of Mandela's longtime friends, expert in the politics of South Africa, and who was there to witness many of the things that he ends up recording. So think about it for a moment. If you had biography of Nelson Mandela that was from, say, anonymous, or you had a biography of Nelson Mandela from Anthony Sampson and it said authorized biography, which would you pick? Well, you would pick the one that was authorized because you have a credible reason to think I'm getting firsthand, eyewitness, authorized information. Now, think about that for the Gospels for a moment. If you wanted to know about the historical Jesus, it would be really good not just to have a story of Jesus from who knows who, but a story written by the people who were actually there, who were eyewitnesses, and could have been commissioned by Jesus to tell Jesus' story. Is there anybody in the ancient world that fits the bill for that? And the answer is there are. We actually know the names of these individuals. They're called the apostles. They're the original 12. We know their names historically. We know they really lived. And we know that Jesus commissioned them to tell his story. So not only were they eyewitnesses, not only were they there, not only were they Jesus' best friends, but Jesus sent them out and said, I want you to tell my story. Pass along my teachings. Tell what happened. I want you to share that with the world. Now, if you had a choice between a gospel written by one of Jesus' best friends or a gospel that was from anonymous, which would you pick? Answer, you'd pick one from his best friends who were eyewitnesses on the ground. By the way, I don't know if you thought about it for a moment. It's one thing to have a gospel written in the first century, which we already talked about, but theoretically, you could have a gospel written in the first century that was not written by an eyewitness. But here, we're talking about not only having a gospel written in the first century, but written possibly by someone who's actually an eyewitness, who was there, who saw these things, but not just an eyewitness, a commissioned eyewitness. Make no mistake about it, there are many eyewitnesses of the events of Jesus, but not all were authorized to tell his story. So if you wanted the real story of Jesus, you would not want merely an eyewitness, not simply one from the first century, but someone who had been commissioned to tell his story. And the names of those people are apostles. So do we have any reason to think our Gospels are written by apostles, or at least that they have material that comes directly from an apostle? And the answer is we have tremendous amounts of evidence for this. We don't have time in our session tonight to go through each of these individually one by one, all four, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So I'll just give you one example here to drive home how we know these things. Let's take John as an example. Let's imagine you look at the Gospel of John, and at the top of it, it says, of course, the Gospel according to John. And you wonder, well, how do I know that the name attached to this Gospel is actually the person who really wrote it? Yeah, it says it's from John, but how do I know it's from John? How do I know it's from John, the son of Zebedee, one of the 12, who was actually one of Jesus' original followers and eyewitnesses? How do I determine that? Well, actually, there's lots of ways we determine that on historical levels, but let me just mention one. One way we can ascertain whether a book was written by the purported author is to look at the earliest Christian followers and who they thought that book came from. In other words, early patristic testimony about who that author was. We actually have this in spades as it pertains to the Gospel of John. One of the most famous is a 2nd century author by the name of Irenaeus. Maybe you've never heard of Irenaeus, but he was a massive figure in 2nd century Christianity. And Irenaeus tells us that when you say, or that when you read this gospel says the gospel according to John, that John is John the son of Zebedee, brother of James, one of the 12, who was with Jesus from the beginning. Now you might think to yourself, well, okay, but why should I believe Irenaeus? Maybe Irenaeus got it wrong. Yeah, that's true, it's possible. So where did Irenaeus get his information from? Almost certainly, we know this, he got it from his mentor, who was a person by the name of Polycarp, who was an earlier church father. So you might ask, well, what makes me think that Polycarp would have gotten that right? Here's what's amazing. You know who Polycarp's mentor was? John himself. So just let this sink in for a moment. You have John, the actual historical figure, the son of Zebedee, mentors a guy named Polycarp who mentors Irenaeus, and Irenaeus tells us that the gospel called John was written by that John. And when Irenaeus tells us that, he's only one person removed from John himself. That's a remarkable historical connection. And after all that, a person could still say, yeah, okay, he's only one removed from John himself, but he still could have gotten it wrong. Yep, it's possible. Lots of things are possible historically. But that's not really the question historians ask. We don't ask what's possible. We ask what's probable. We ask what's likely, what's reasonable. Is it likely to think that Irenaeus would have gotten that wrong? Certainly not. And what you realize, we have every good reason to think that John's gospel actually comes from one of Jesus' authorized biographers. By the way, we could do the same thing with Matthew, Mark, and Luke. even though Mark and Luke were not written directly by apostles in the sense that they held the pen, we have every reason to know they go right back straight to one of them. In fact, Mark's tradition comes clearly from Peter himself. When you read Mark's gospel, you're getting effectively Peter's gospel. Every piece of historical evidence points to that fact. So what does that mean? That means our gospels are the only ones that have a credible connection to the apostles. Now you might wonder, what about these other gospels out there? What about, say, the Gospel of Thomas? It could not possibly have been written by the Gospel of Thomas or by the Apostle Thomas, because the Gospel of Thomas was dated in the 2nd century or later, just like every other gospel was. We talked about that in our first point. That means that there's no other gospel that has a credible connection to the apostles, because no other gospels are from the 1st century. Now you might wonder, well, why is the Gospel of Thomas called the Gospel of Thomas if it wasn't really written by Thomas? Well, just think about it for a moment. If you're trying to write a gospel in the 2nd century and get a hearing for it, what are you going to call it, right? You're not going to call it Bob's Gospel, right? You're going to come up with some name that people want to hear, some famous person. By the way, have you noticed how many apocryphal gospels we have that are attached to famous names? It's Gospel of Thomas, an apostle. Gospel of Peter, an apostle. Gospel of Mary, a companion of the apostles. Gospel of Judas, an apostle. It just keeps going on and on and on. You can tell in the 2nd century they're grabbing for famous names to try to attach their gospels to. But none of them could go back to an apostle, because all those other gospels are 2nd century or later. Now, those first 2 points are pretty significant. We have the earliest gospels we have are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and the only ones with even a shot to be written by one of Jesus' followers, his authorized biographers. Okay, that leads us to a third thing tonight that sets our gospels apart. Not just the when, and not just the who, but now we turn our attention to the what, if you will. And that is pertaining to content. Here's the third difference. Our canonical gospels lack the legendary embellishments of many later gospels. Our gospels lack the legendary embellishments of many later gospels. One of the things that people don't realize when they read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John is how they tell the story of Jesus in such a restrained, matter-of-fact way. Now, I know you're thinking to yourself, well, it doesn't seem very restrained and matter-of-fact. I mean, aren't the Gospels filled with miracles? Aren't they filled with stories that are hard to believe? Isn't it? Don't they all end with a resurrection? How is that restrained and matter-of-fact? Well, actually, it is restrained and matter-of-fact when you actually look at the broad swath of gospel writing in early Christianity. Then it becomes very clear why the canonical Gospels sound so tame in the way they tell the story, and actually resist some of the temptations that are so common in storytelling. I'll give you a couple of examples to drive this home. Have you ever noticed that when you read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and you read about the resurrection of Jesus, has it ever dawned on you before that when it comes to the story of the resurrection of Jesus, you actually don't have an account in the Gospels that watches and sees Jesus coming out of the tomb alive? You don't actually have anyone positioned as an eyewitness to see Jesus resurrect from the dead and walk out of the tomb. In fact, in the Gospels, all you have is the women showing up early that Sunday morning, and when they get there, the stone is already rolled away, the tomb is already empty, Jesus is gone, they don't see him rise from the dead, he's already risen by the time they get there. Now, if you were making up the Gospels and you were making up the story of Jesus, and the crescendo of your narrative is the resurrection, which it clearly is the crescendo, everything's been building up to this man rising from the dead, would you not have positioned some eyewitness there who could have watched it happen and give you effectively a videotape of Jesus coming out of the tomb? That's not what we find in the canonical Gospels. In fact, in the canonical Gospels, the women just show up, the stone's already gone, as if that's kind of what happened. It's a very restrained and matter-of-fact way of telling the story. Now, if you want a gospel that tells you or shows you a videotape, so to speak, of Jesus coming out of the tomb, there's a gospel for you. It's actually called the Gospel of Peter. The Gospel of Peter actually solves that problem, so to speak, in the canonical Gospels by making sure there's plenty of eyewitnesses around when Jesus rises from the dead. The Gospel of Peter was not written by Peter. It's a later apocryphal gospel, but in that story, you can tell the legendary embellishments have started to grow. So that in the resurrection account in the Gospel of Peter, now there's eyewitnesses positioned all around the tomb. In fact, not just eyewitnesses, but all the 12 are there waiting for Jesus to rise. And all the Jewish leaders are waiting for Jesus to rise. All the Roman officials are there waiting for Jesus to rise. So that when he rises from the tomb, all of them are right there to see it happen. And then it goes in beyond that. When Jesus comes out of the tomb in the Gospel of Peter, he's not the Jesus you remember. He's not the Jesus you think you remember, because when he comes out of the tomb in the Gospel of Peter, he's a giant Jesus. He's a Jesus whose head goes further than the clouds in the sky. He's what I tell my students, he's Godzilla Jesus coming out of the tomb. And then more than that, he's flanked by angels who are also giant, huge, massive, heads going all the way to the clouds. And then it gets even more strange, because following Jesus out of the tomb in the Gospel of Peter is the cross itself. That's strange. Usually in the Roman world, when you kill someone, you don't send them home with a cross. Here, have this in your grave. And even if they did, the question in the story is, well, how is the cross following Jesus out of the tomb in the Gospel of Peter? Is it floating? Is it walking? And then things get even weird. The cross starts to talk. So just let this sink in for a moment. You've got, in the Gospel of Peter, obviously all these people ideally positioned to be eyewitnesses with a giant, huge Jesus and a floating, talking cross. And then someone says to you, guys, all Gospels are the same. Really? All Gospels are the same? Is it not obvious that the Gospel of Peter is filling in the gaps left by the 12? Or left by the canonical 4? Now, here's another thing that you may not have noticed about how restrained and matter-of-fact the stories of our Gospels are. Have you ever noticed how little is told in our Gospels about Jesus as a little kid, as a child? By the way, everyone will be curious about this. No doubt you're curious about this. Do you know in the ancient world, when we hear stories of famous rulers and emperors and Caesars, that there's all kinds of evidence that people sort of retroactively created childhood stories around those people to show how great they were before they became great, to show they are already as a kid exhibiting these amazing traits. In the Greco-Roman world, it was standard fare to embellish and prop up your hero by creating these childhood stories where they were amazing and incredible and dynamic and wonderful. Can you imagine the temptation of the gospel authors to do the same? And when you look at all 4 gospels, you know how many stories we have of Jesus as a kid? A grand total of 1 in the Gospel of Luke. And even that, incredibly tame. He's in the temple talking to the teachers of the law. But if you want a story of Jesus as a kid, by the way, there's a gospel for you. It's called the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. By the way, not to be confused with the Gospel of Thomas our friend Muhammad Ali found. The Infancy Gospel of Thomas tells you the story of Jesus as a little boy and has all your questions answered. But when you meet this Jesus in the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, he is a little terror. He is a little kid that you wouldn't want to be around. He is a kid that is so terrorizing this village that basically the people in the village go to Joseph and says, get a handle on your son. You've got to stop him from terrorizing our village. One story in the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, the little boy Jesus, another boy bumps into him, and the little boy Jesus is mad and kills the kid on the spot. And then after he kills the kid on the spot and the villager gets mad, he raises the kid from the dead. And there's another story where he violates the laws on the Sabbath by making pigeons in the mud. And then when they challenge him on it, he makes the pigeons real pigeons and they fly away. And there's another story where he flies off the top of roof buildings. This is the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. And someone will tell you, oh, all Gospels are the same. Really? This is not the same historical storytelling. This is not the same type of gospel scenario. What you have is, in our canonical Gospels, a remarkably restrained, matter-of-fact way of telling the stories. And these later embellishments show themselves to be simply that, later. After the fact, filling in of the gaps left by the canonical 4. Okay, that brings us to the 4th and final thing that I'll mention here. And again, there's more than 4 that set our Gospels apart. And here's that 4th and final thing. Our Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were recognized by the earliest Christians at a very early time. They're recognized as authoritative by the earliest Christians at a very early time. If we want to know what Gospels to read, maybe we could ask the question this way. Which Gospels were the early Christians reading? Which Gospels did they rally around? Which Gospels did they recognize as being the ones that were valid? Now, if you go to a major university religion class, they'll tell you, oh, in the early Christian world, nobody knew what Gospels to read. It was a literary free-for-all. It was the wild, wild west. Everyone's reading whatever they want to read. It was only later, much later, 4th century later, that you have a church council that finally fixes this under the leadership of Constantine and solves the problem. By the way, that whole narrative I just gave you just then, none of that is true, and I'm actually going to deal with that in Sunday school class tomorrow morning. But for our purposes here, this idea that in the literary world of early Christianity that no one knew what gospel to read, once again, is great rhetoric, bad history. Because when we look in the evidence from as early as the 2nd century, it looks like actually Christians did know what gospels to read. If we asked Irenaeus which gospels are there, he doesn't say, well, we're working it out, guys. It's kind of complicated. We're trying to figure out which gospels to read. We'll let you know. No, Irenaeus says, what do you mean what gospels to read? 4, and only 4, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. If you go to our earliest canonical list, the Moratorium Fragment, also in the 2nd century, how many gospels? 4, and what are they? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. If you go to Clement of Alexandria, also in the 2nd century, and ask him which gospels you should read, which ones are scripture? Well, 4, only 4, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and the same thing over and over and over again. In fact, the manuscripts bear this out. When we look at manuscripts, when gospels are combined into a single manuscript, we can never find a single instance anywhere where apocryphal gospels and canonical gospels are combined in the same codex. Whenever you find multiple gospels in a manuscript, guess which ones they are? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. In other words, when you ask the question of what gospels the earliest Christians are reading, it wasn't a literary free-for-all. They were quite settled that these were the 4, and actually the only 4 that Christians should deem as scripture. Okay, what have we been doing here? We've been asking the question that Walter Bauer has raised and that our postmodern world has raised, which is, I guess if you got a lot of different views of Jesus, all of them are equally valid, right? If you have a lot of different gospels, all of them are equally valid, right? You can just pick the Jesus you want to pick. Well, I suppose if you just keep distance from the facts and just want to look at the rhetoric, yeah, I guess it means that. But if you care about history and you care about data and you care about legitimacy of these gospels, what you quickly realize is they're not all the same. Our gospels actually have made it into our New Testaments for a reason. They're the earliest gospels we have. They're the only ones with a historically credible connection to the apostles. They lack the legendary embellishments of the later gospels. And most importantly, they were the ones that the early Christians rallied around from a very early point. Thank you very much. All right, we're going to take just a couple moments after this first session and open it up for Q&A before we take a quick break and move on to session 2. So here's your chance. If you want to interact with any of the things I've just laid out, those 4 points, or something else related to the reliability of the Gospels, this is a good chance for you to just raise your hand and we'll take a few minutes to interact. I see we have our microphone man here, so if we need that, we can do it. Yeah, we got a hand over here. Wonderful.
Hello? Maybe. Just want to make sure is it projecting also? Huh? No, there it is. Okay. Thank you, Dr. Kruger. I guess my question is related to who do you find in academia or just in the popular understanding, or I don't know, this pops up during Easter season or whatever, the Jesus Seminar and their ilk for decades were kind of maybe the main cultural force in the Western world behind, propounding or pushing forward these Gnostic Gospels as serious alternatives to the canonical ones. It seems like, I don't know, from a layperson's perspective, their influence has waned over the last couple decades or so, although maybe they would still get consulted during Easter season or whatever. But who do you find these days that is throwing into doubt the canonical gospels either from an academic perspective or from a group or movement or whatever it is? Like who is championing these ideas today?
Yeah, great question. So the landscape has changed dramatically. Your read on the Jesus Seminar is correct. If you don't know what the Jesus Seminar is, it's a group of scholars that were formed in the 1980s, and they were sort of the big deal in the 80s and 90s about Jesus scholarship, and they were very radical and very much on the left side of everything. They've waned considerably to the point where they're really not even in play anymore. Certainly Bart Ehrman's work is still out there. I'm going to say more about Dr. Ehrman in the second hour and his impact. Where the landscape is now is, this is going to sound crazy, but it's true. The sort of gospel skeptics now are largely, peddling their wares on YouTube. I can't tell you how many times I get sent YouTube videos from folks who actually have some scholarly credentials who are pushing their critical views of the Gospels on YouTube, and I get sent these all the time in my inbox. Are you going to respond to this guy? Can you respond to this guy? He mentioned you. Will you rebuttal this guy? And I'm like, I guess I got to get on YouTube. I'm a step behind. I'm too busy writing books than forming videos. But yeah, that's where it's happening. And a lot of the college students I interact with are watching these YouTube videos. I think about someone like a Dan McClellan. I think about, well, there's just so many now that are on there, all of which with some sort of claim to have a PhD and that are pushing these ideas. So yeah, be careful what you watch on YouTube. And there's a lot of good stuff on YouTube too, and so thankfully, but that's where it's happening today. Great question. Yeah, there's a question here, and I saw another hand back here in the middle. Yeah, you got it. Go ahead.
Real quick question. When you talked about Bart Ehrman, where does he place the writing? I could look this up for myself, but
Yeah.
it's just handier to ask you. Where does he place, like Mark, you said 50s, maybe 60s?
Yeah. So
80s for John?
So Bart would have a pretty traditional view. When I say traditional, I mean as far as secular scholars go. So he would put Mark around 70. He would put Luke and Matthew in the 80s. He put John in the 90s. Yeah, standard fare. And, there's a few evangelicals that have that view. I think evangelicals typically have Mark pre-70 and often have Matthew and Luke pre-72. But, I don't really have a care either way about, a decade here or there on these dates. Ehrman's complaint about the four Gospels even isn't really so much about their dates. He would challenge their authorship. And, we would have to get into the weeds of that. But he would agree, as almost all scholars do, like I said, that they're all first century at some level. John is the last, Mark is the first. Almost everyone agrees about that. Yep. You're going to earn your calorie count today, your footsteps. Yes.
Could you just give us a summary of how historians have concluded that the non-canonical Gospels are written in the 2nd century and not the 1st?
Yeah, great question. So if you didn't catch the question, how do we know that these non-canonical Gospels are written in the 2nd century? What's interesting is if you take the Gospel of Thomas, which we've been talking about tonight because of our friend Muhammad Ali, interestingly, Thomas was the Gospel that for a few years people were trying to shove into the 1st century, and the rest of the scholarly community was like, we're not convinced. Well, now that all is ended because a number of years ago, 2 major works were published on the Gospel of Thomas and its date. These were published by scholars by the name of Simon Gathercole at Cambridge and Mark Goodacre at Duke. And both published their books, I think, in the same year, interestingly, and reached the same conclusion, both of which concluded that the Gospel of Thomas was written at the end of the 2nd century. So that pretty much just settled that. And so now you don't have anyone who's trying to push that anymore. How do they know the Gospel of Thomas is written at the end of the 2nd century? There's a lot that goes into that. But one of the major ways we know about a late date for books like the Gospel of Thomas is, one, you can see that they all know the canonical Gospels and are building off the canonical Gospels and riffing off them and filling in the gaps left in them. And so that's one way we know they're late. The other way we know they're late is a lot of these late Gospels talk about issues that only popped up in that century. One of the things that's classic in the 2nd century is what is called Gnosticism, although that term is now debated, or Valentinian Gnosticism, which is a distinctively 2nd century phenomenon. So if you have a gospel that is Valentinian, it's not 1st century. Because Valentinian Gnosticism is 2nd century and not 1st century. And we have a lot of gospels that do that, including Thomas, and the Gospel of Truth, and the Gospel of Philip, and a lot of the Nag Hammadi collection. So those are some of the ways we know how these gospels are late. Yeah, a couple more questions here before we take our break. Yeah, in the back. You can just speak loudly. Yep.
Behind Luke.
Yeah, so the question was, if Peter's behind Mark, who's behind Luke? This is one of the wonderful things about Luke, is that Luke is the only gospel we have that actually gives us in his opening lines why he wrote, where he got his information from, and what his purpose in writing was. It's called the Lucan Prologue, which is the first 4 verses, very vastly studied. What does Luke do there? He positions himself as a student of the apostles. In fact, he uses a phrase there in the Greek that basically says, I have basically been, people tend to think of Luke as like an investigative reporter. That's not really the better way to think of it. He's basically, I've been a student of these things. I've been under the 12. And he calls the 12 the eyewitnesses and ministers of the word. He uses the term eyewitnesses and effectively says, my gospel is coming from their material. Now, you could argue the question, well, maybe Luke just made that up. Maybe he claimed to be all that and it wasn't that. But we have all kinds of corroborating evidence about that because we know Luke traveled with the apostles in the book of Acts. We know it's mentioned by Paul himself. We know he was a companion of Paul. We have all kinds of different things that make that fit. And so Luke actually is as well positioned as anybody to give you direct apostolic testimony. So if you have him and Mark doing what they're doing, then Matthew and John are actual apostles. I mean, if I'm choosing which gospels I'm going to trust, I'm like, I'll take those four because those are giving me the most direct access I can get to the person of Jesus. Great. We'll do one more question before our break. One more. Yes, right here. Yep. Yeah, I'm always surprised by this. Yeah, people think, okay, so if I'm going to write a gospel about the life and teachings of Jesus, I do that within 6 months of his death. Otherwise, it's no longer trustworthy. I'm like, well, okay. We know our gospel writers probably wrote anywhere from 20 to 40 years after the life of Jesus, okay, depending on, or 20 to 50 years after the life of Jesus, depending on how you do the math. A good example of a person who did this was John Adams. John Adams gives his work on the Revolutionary War was written about 50 years after the Revolutionary War, before he died. And he was there, he was an eyewitness, and he drew upon his earlier diaries that he took while he was living through those times. And so if you think about John Adams' own writings on the Revolutionary War, they actually mimic our Gospels actually quite well. He actually functions a little bit like John does, sort of the last living patriarch who gives you his story right before he dies and leans on earlier writings to pull it together. So when we say our Gospel authors wrote somewhere between 50 and 90 AD, we're not suggesting that when they wrote, that they never used earlier sources or earlier documents or earlier records that they had kept or what have you, but that the final version of that gospel obviously was written at that time. So it's not like, it was 50 years of oral tradition and then suddenly someone goes, hey, we should write this down. Yeah, why didn't we think of that? We really ought to write this down. I think they were already writing it down, and I think we have good reasons to think that, which I've covered in some of my other books. That's a great question. Now, speaking of writing things down, one of the big challenges of the reliability of the Gospels and the New Testament in general is not just whether it was written down accurately, but whether it was copied accurately. Was it corrupted? Was it changed? Was it edited by scribes? That's what I'm going to talk about when we get back from our break. So who is going to give instructions on the break here? 10 minutes? What are we doing? 5 to 10 minutes. And then I will jump back up here and we will talk about scribal changes. See you shortly. Shock collars. All right.
Okay, let's try to find our seats if we could, so we can take the best opportunity of the time that's been afforded us. And that includes you, Greg. All right. As soon as Greg quiets down, we will resume here. He still hasn't heard me. All right. Thank you. Let's turn it back over to Dr. Kruger for part two. How many are looking forward to part two? This will be good. We've covered some of this already in our church, but it'll be good to get more details fleshed out.
All right, welcome back. It's always nice when your pastor calls you out from the front by name, when you're chit-chatting. That's always a good motivation to make sure you're behaving yourself and back on time. All right, I'm excited about this second session with you tonight. Remember, we're talking about the three major attacks on the Bible. It's historicity. We talked about that in the first session, narrowly focusing on the Gospels. Second, the transmission, which we're getting ready to tackle now. And then in the morning, I'll say more about canon and the misconceptions that surround canon, how our Bible, particularly the New Testament, again, was put together and assembled, and how those decisions were made and when they happened. So that's going to be all part of our weekend together. Right now, though, I want to talk about this issue of the transmission of the New Testament text. And I want to begin by sort of a little bit of my own story to start us out here autobiographically. So I get asked a lot when I travel and speak, how did you get interested in these topics? I mean, apocryphal Gospels and New Testament canon and what's called textual criticism, which we're getting ready to dive into now. It all actually begins my freshman year in college. I'm from North Carolina, as many of you know, and when I was a freshman, I found myself at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. And I'd grown up in a Christian home and had a good youth group and was a believer and wanted to follow Christ in college. And I had received all kinds of advice about how to make sure I didn't lose my way at the university setting. And I tried to take that advice seriously. And when I got to college, I figured, hey, I grew up in a Christian home and had a good church. I feel as ready as anyone could be for what I'm getting ready to experience here. And in some ways I was ready. But I found myself in a university religion class as a freshman, and I found out that in many ways I was not ready, and not even close to ready. When I was a freshman, I had to take a religion class as part of the repertoire of general ed at UNC. And so I had to go pick some religion class to check the box in my sort of general ed requirements. So I'm flipping through the catalog. Yes, this is back when we had physical catalogs. And I saw a class called Introduction to the New Testament. Great. So I found myself on the very first day in this class called Introduction to the New Testament. Didn't take long to realize that the professor had an eye towards evangelicals, and that he was lecturing in such a way that he sort of indicated, I used to be one of you. I used to think what you thought. I used to believe what you believed. I used to think the Bible was inspired. I used to think it was from God, and I used to think this and that. But then I went and got a PhD, and I realized none of that's true. And this class is basically going to be about all the problems with the New Testament. And he started going through the list, right, that the Bible is filled with forgers who pretend to be authors they're not, that the gospel accounts are filled with stories that are fabricated and made up, that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John contradict each other and don't mesh together. And on he went in this litany of attacks. And I thought to myself, what have I gotten into this semester? But then he came to the argument that was his favorite. And it was obviously his favorite because he seemed to perk up every time he brought it up, which is the real issue isn't even all the things I just told you. The real issue isn't whether the Bible contradicts itself or whether it's historically reliable or whether it's been fabricated, because we don't actually even have it. We don't actually have the words of the New Testament in order to even make those declarations, because the Bible has been so corrupted, so changed, so altered in its transmission history that you could never really know what it said And so all of our discussions about this or that are all sort of, to some extent, irrelevant because we actually don't have a New Testament text that gives us any reason to think it was what was written in the first century. We just have copies of copies of copies of copies of copies of copies of copies, all of which have been changed thousands and thousands of times. In fact, Ehrman said in class that maybe upwards of 200 to 400,000 textual variants in our New Testament textual tradition. Now, at the time, I was, 19 years old, 18 years old, sitting in a university class thinking, what? I've never heard this before. I'd never heard of any of this before. I never heard of any of the things he was bringing up. This was all brand new to me. And this idea about textual variations was particularly brand new to me. And I thought, I'd been good if someone had told me about that ahead of time, if I had gotten someone to give me a little bit of a heads up on some of these things ahead of time. And this is the realization that what I thought I was ready for, I wasn't really ready for. Which, sidebar, is why I wrote my book, Surviving Religion 101, which is about helping college students get ready for those sorts of things, or high school students who are almost headed to college get ready for these sorts of things. But I wasn't ready. And so I began to wonder, maybe everything I've ever believed is just a lie. Maybe it's just not true at all. And have you ever had that moment in your Christian life where you just sort of wake up at a moment and think to yourself, maybe I'm the one that's wrong. Maybe everything is just false. Maybe all the critics are actually right. And you have that sort of queasy feeling in your stomach where you're like, wow, maybe I'm as deceived as anyone could possibly be. So I had that sort of critical moment. I was like, what am I going to do here about this? As was said in the introduction, that professor's name, as I've already indicated, was Bart Ehrman, who now has written over 30 books in the field of New Testament. And his most famous and the New York Times bestseller that really put him on the map was the one written about this topic. You've probably heard the title. It's called Misquoting Jesus. And now the misquoting Jesus thing has sort of been his mantra. By the way, if you can write a book on textual criticism that becomes a New York Times bestseller, that is accomplishing something, I've got to say. Now, it's a lot easier to get yourself as a New York Times bestseller when your argument is that you can't trust anything it says. Because if I were to write a pop book on text criticism and tell you could trust everything it says, once again, it wouldn't sell probably nearly as many. But nonetheless, it was quite an accomplishment to sell that many books. When I had him as a professor, of course, he was brand new. Maybe 30 years old when I had him as a professor. And he just retired, by the way, in December, 3 months ago. So now he's officially retired, but still busy on the speaker circuit. And the thing he talks about most of the time is this. And the thing I get most of the questions about is this. What do we do with all the changes and corruptions of scribal variations in the New Testament? Are there really 400,000 of them? By the way, if there are 400,000 textual variants, that's more words than there are in the entire New Testament. The whole New Testament has 130,000 words, roughly. So we have more textual variants, 3 times plus more than than all the words in the New Testament. Now, as you can imagine, when you use shock value numbers like that, you probably aren't getting the whole story. And I can tell you, you're not getting the whole story. And so what I want to do in this session is to respond to those claims. Is it true that the New Testament is wildly corrupt? Is it true that we have really no confidence in the New Testament text? Is it true that we really can't know what the original writer said? Here's one of the things I have to say, because I'm getting ready to respond to that and obviously say none of that's the case. In fact, I think we have tremendously good textual tradition for the New Testament. I'm a little amazed that Ehrman has made this his key argument, because I think it's his weakest argument. Other arguments he makes at least have some punch to them. I mean, I don't agree in the end, but I mean, at least he's trying to get somewhere, and he has something to say that I think is challenging for us. This actually is, ironically, where our best evidence is. So I'm still a little confused why this is where he spends most of his time. I've got to believe it's probably due to the way statistics can be used to make things sound a lot worse than they really are. But to those in the field, realize actually that the text critical side is where we shine. So it's far from being a hole in our system. It's actually one of its greatest strengths, which, of course, when I was 19-year-old sitting in the class, I never knew that. But one of the things I did when I was there is I decided, surely these aren't new questions that are being asked. Surely these are not challenges that had never been heard before. So I'm going to go out and find out if someone's tried to answer these before. And I discovered that they had been answered before and answered many times before and answered quite well. And we never got any of those, quote, answers in the class because he wasn't interested in answers. He was interested more in questions and leaving people with questions. All right, so how are we going to respond to this? How are we going to analyze whether our textual tradition is reliable when he says it's not? Well, this is a massive field called textual criticism. I've written on this field in lots of different spaces and lots of chapters and books and sections and journal articles, and we won't be able to deal with everything that can be dealt with. But if you want to assess the textual reliability of any document of antiquity, leave aside whether it's the New Testament or not, there's three factors that have to come into play. And we're going to look at those exact same three factors. What are those factors? You want to ask about the quantity of the manuscripts that you have of that document, the date of those manuscripts, secondly, how early they are, and thirdly, the quality of those manuscripts. How carefully have they been copied? So quantity, date, and quality. Like I said, this is a trio that applies to any document of antiquity. If we were looking tonight at Tacitus's Roman history, which I'm sure you're glad we're not looking at tonight, or there may not have been anybody in the room who cares anything at all about what Tacitus wrote about the history of Rome. Published around 100 AD, so slightly after our New Testament was completed, but not by much. Tacitus's Roman history is actually where we get quite a bit of information about the unfolding of the early years of the empire. And if I were here talking about whether we can trust what Tacitus wrote, I would ask the same three questions. How many copies of Roman history do we have? How early are those copies compared to when it was published? And what do we see within the copies in terms of their comparisons with one another? How much have they been altered and changed? And do I have any evidence that the scribes knew what they were doing? By the way, one of the sub-arguments that Ehrman makes is that scribes in the Christian space didn't know what they were doing. He makes the argument, not merely do we have all the textual variations themselves, but we have evidence that scribes were inept and incompetent and unprofessional, and he even goes as far as to claim at one point that the scribes sometimes couldn't even read. They were completely illiterate when they were copying the New Testament. I'm going to challenge all those things. I think our evidence for a scribal infrastructure is actually pretty remarkable. Again, we only have a limited amount of time tonight to work through this. Okay, so let's talk about those three things I mentioned as it pertains to the New Testament, and we begin with the quantity of manuscripts. When you do an analysis of any document of antiquity, quantity is where it all begins. How many copies do I have of the book I'm trying to analyze? For text critics, copies matter, and they matter a lot. If you're laying out your dream, like what would be the best thing, you'd want multiple, many, as many as possible of copies of any text. Why? Why is it important that you have multiple copies of any manuscript? Because the more copies you have, the more you can compare them. And when you can compare them, you can see how stable the text is. I mean, just think about it for a moment. Let's imagine that we're analyzing the Gospel of Luke, and all I have is one copy of Luke. One. Now, it might be a reliable copy. It might be a very unreliable copy. How would I know? If I wanted to take this copy of Luke and ask, is it a trustworthy copy, what am I comparing it to? Answer, nothing, because I only have one copy. If I have more than one copy, I can at least say, well, I've got two copies of Luke. How faithful is tradition? What if I have 5 or 50 or 500? The more copies, the better it comes to any particular document in the ancient world. One of the things you have to realize in the ancient world, of course, is that copies are hard to come by. Their manuscripts are easily destroyed. The two types of material that our manuscripts were copied on in the ancient world were papyrus, of course, on the one hand, and what's called parchment or vellum on the other hand. So you have basically plant material made out of the reeds of the Nile and papyrus, or animal skins, usually made from sheep, but sometimes calves and things like this. And these things decayed. They rotted. Insects ate them. They were burned. They were destroyed. They were crushed and wiped out by foreign armies. We never have as many as we wish of all the millions of documents that were published in the ancient world we wish we had, we have only a small smidgen of. This is particularly interesting when you think about where we find our copies, because one of the things that's the quickest thing to destroy any document in the ancient world is moisture. If you have humidity, your document has a very short lifespan. It just is going to literally rot away. And so no surprise that most of the documents that we find in the sands of Egypt, of any ancient books, tend to be in the sands of Egypt, because that's the driest place you could have when it comes to finding documents in the ancient world. So if we were going to look at documents from about the same time period of the New Testament, what would count as a lot of copies? Let's go back to Tacitus for a moment. How many copies do we have of his Annals of History, which basically date from about the same time as the New Testament? The answer is we have about 3. Jewish War, which is written by Josephus, about the same time, a little bit earlier. We have around 50, which is really good for a document that's 2,000 years old. And I would say that the average is somewhere around 10 or 20. If you have a document that was published in the 1st century, how many copies do you expect to have through entire history of that book before the printing press, up to the 14th century? How many copies do you expect to have? Well, if I had 10, I'd be pretty happy. If I had 20, I might be doing cartwheels as an ancient historian. If I had 50, I would think I struck gold. Because you just have to understand how copies were destroyed and lost. We just don't have that many for obvious reasons. Over time, they have all kinds of things that can harm them and destroy them. Here's where we come to the New Testament. When we come to the New Testament, we are sitting on an embarrassment of riches. We have over 5,700 copies of the New Testament today and counting. This is a mind-blowing number. It's the kind of number that you don't even really have a way to wrap your mind around. We have so many more copies of the New Testament of any ancient document. There's no ancient document even comes close to the New Testament in terms of the total number of copies extant of it. So when it comes to our manuscript tradition, here's what I want you to realize. We have the best evidence to work with. If you can make a conclusion about the New Testament's transmission, you can be pretty sure that whatever conclusion we reach is pretty reliable, because we have so many copies to compare over so much a span of time. And so this is a remarkable thing to observe. By the way, you may not realize that we're still discovering copies of the New Testament today. I tell my students about the most famous archaeological dig in the world right now is in a city you've never heard of. It's in a place also in Egypt called Oxyrhynchus. So now you've heard of 2 crazy cities in the ancient world. Nag Hammadi, where our friend Muhammad Ali found the Gospel of Thomas, and Oxyrhynchus. Okay, Oxyrhynchus is a city in the ancient Roman world that thrived and then was lost in the sands of Egypt for 1,000 years, and no one knew where the lost city of Oxyrhynchus was. And then a couple of Oxford scholars in 1897, 1898 went looking for the lost city of Oxyrhynchus, something like Raiders of the Lost Ark, and they found it. And when they found the lost city of Oxyrhynchus, not only did they find the city, but they found the dumping ground for old manuscripts. They found the garbage heap for old manuscripts in the lost city of Oxyrhynchus, which contains thousands upon thousands upon thousands upon thousands of ancient manuscripts. Not just of the Bible, of just about everything you can imagine. Greco-Roman works, Greek literature, poetry. We've got what are called documentary papyri, which are, private letters, receipts and bills of sale and things like this. And we also have biblical texts. And what we found in Oxyrhynchus is an explosion of New Testament manuscripts and Old Testament manuscripts too. And do you realize that archaeological dig is still active now in 2026, having started in 1898, and it is still an active archaeological dig. They are still publishing and discovering manuscripts today. In fact, any given year, you can go and pull off the shelf, if your library is sophisticated enough to have it, a volume called the Oxyrhynchus Papyri, which will give you a look at what the latest discoveries are at Oxyrhynchus. And every now and then, and not every now and then, almost every year, there's new copies of the New Testament. A new copy from John, a new copy from Romans, another text of Galatians, something from 1 Thessalonians. My students ask me all the time, if they're still discovering biblical manuscripts, why am I not hearing about this on the news? Why is this not on TV? I tell them, I was like, well, I'll tell you why, because every time they find, let's say, a new copy of Luke, it looks pretty much like every other copy of Luke. And it doesn't really change anything materially. I said, do you think if they found a copy of Luke that was radically different than every other copy of Luke, you think you'd hear that on the evening news? The answer is absolutely. So in this sense, no news is good news. This is happening behind the scenes. You don't even know it. And the reason it doesn't make the news is because it doesn't change anything. The text is so predictably stable that every new copy, for the most part, tells us what we already knew from every other copy we already had. Here's another thing to take away about the quantity of manuscripts. Not only does this position us well to evaluate our New Testament, but almost certainly guarantees that the original text is somewhere in that collection. Remember, what's the big concern about textual criticism? The big concern is, what if we had the words of the New Testament that were lost? What if they got changed and we can't get back to what they originally said? Well, if I only had one copy of Luke, I could really be concerned about that, because that one copy may be good or may be bad. I have no way to know what the original might have said. But if I have thousands of copies of the New Testament, there's a lot of confidence that in that repertoire, in that cachet of literature, is the original text. And I can be absolutely sure it's in there and recoverable. And that's exactly, as I'll show in a moment, what we do find. One more observation about quantity before we leave it. And this is something that's often overlooked. Here's what's interesting about the New Testament. Every time you find a new manuscript, you know what you also find? New textual variations. Because every time you find a new manuscript, you get to observe just more scribal mistakes. And by the way, I'll get to the scribal mistakes in a moment, but scribes made mistakes just like everybody makes mistakes. They were just doing their job, and if you copied that many books, you'd make mistakes too. I guarantee you, if I gave you one paragraph to copy tonight in a handwritten way, you'd make multiple mistakes in one sitting with one paragraph you may not even realize. The scribes did a fantastic job, as we'll discover, but they did make scribal variations, just like anybody would in the ancient world. And every new manuscript we discover gives you an opportunity to know more scribal variations. And this brings us back to Ehrman's number. He says there's 200,000 to 400,000 textual variants. He may well be right about the number, but that number doesn't mean anything until you realize something. The only reason the number is so high for the New Testament is because we have so many more manuscripts than any other book in antiquity. And every new manuscript is a new opportunity to count up more textual variants. If I had Tacitus's Roman history and I have 3 copies, how many textual variants am I going to have? Only 3 copies worth. Does that mean it's more reliably copied? No, it doesn't have 5,700 copies to compare. The more copies you have, the more discovery of textual variants. And so what should be good news is turned around by Ehrman to make it look like it's bad news. And that's what's frustrating about this. The only reason we have this many variants isn't because our scribes are bad at their job. The reason we have this many variants is because we just know about so many more variants because we have so many more copies. This is a really critical thing that makes these statistics just start to melt away. And there's another thing I'll tell you in a minute that really makes them melt away. Okay, first of our 3, quantity of New Testament manuscripts. Let's move on to a second here, which is the date. When are these manuscripts dated? Now, by the way, important distinction to make. In the prior lecture, I talked about dating, but I talked about dating in terms of the publication of a book. Mark was written, say, in the 60s. John was maybe written in the 80s or 90s. Okay, that's the date of the book's writing. We're not talking about that here. We're talking about the date of the manuscript of that book. So you might have a lot of copies, but the question is, how close do those copies get to the time of publication? Now, a good way to analyze this is to go back to our buddy Tacitus, who's the Roman historian we've been talking about. We don't have that many copies of Tacitus's work in terms of total quantity, but now we're going to ask a second question about his work. How early are those copies? It was written, Roman history was written about 100 AD. Do we have a copy of Tacitus from, say, 200 AD? Nope. Do we have a copy of Tacitus from 300 AD? I wish. No. 400 AD, 500 AD, no. 600 AD, no. 700 AD, no. 800, no. Our earliest copy of Roman history is from the 9th century. 800 years after Tacitus wrote his book, our first glimpse at the text in history is 800 years later after he wrote it. Now you might think, and you ought to think, wow, that's a pretty big gap. How do I know that the thing I'm looking at in the 8th century is actually what Tacitus wrote in the 1st century? I have 800 years to account for there. And I don't even have that many copies to compare to one another. I don't see scholars walking around thinking, well, no one knows what Tacitus says. Not a lot of skepticism there, but nonetheless, you think that's a pretty big problem to have that kind of gap. And by the way, that kind of gap is pretty normal. The average gap for a document from the 1st century to our earliest copy is somewhere between 500 and 1,000 years. And no one in the world of antiquities even shrugs at that. They're like, well, yeah, that's just the way the world works. I already said we don't get that many copies of things, and we certainly don't get many old copies. How about the New Testament? What's the oldest copy we have of the New Testament? Believe it or not, the New Testament was written in the 1st century. We've already established that. Our earliest copies go all the way back to the 2nd century. This is stunningly early. In fact, I just published an article this year. This came out actually in November in a chapter of a series of invited essays in a chapter in a book on the 2nd century. And my task was to analyze all the possible 2nd century manuscripts of the New Testament. And as I was writing that chapter, I was just amazed that we have any 2nd century manuscripts of the New Testament. It is remarkable to have a glimpse at the text that early. And we have not just like one or two, we have all kinds of different books accounted for in the 2nd century. John is by far the most popular. We've got quite a bit of Matthew. We have other kinds of books floating around, Revelation, and we can get a glimpse at a decent number of books in the New Testament as early as the 2nd century. You know what we find? Pretty much the same text we have now. A good example of this is a manuscript by the name of Papyrus 66. P66 is one of our earliest copies of the Gospel of John. It's late 2nd, probably early 3rd, so it's slightly out of the 2nd century, but right around 200 AD. And it's a remarkable copy because it's almost complete. It's almost the entire Gospel of John from 200 AD. By the way, you can go online and look at photographic facsimiles of this now. You can literally flip through the pages of P66 on your screen. It's all in Greek, of course, but you're looking at a 2nd century, 3rd century manuscript. You can just flip through the pages. And so I have a class at RTS I teach on the origins of the New Testament canon, where one of my assignments is I give them high-definition photographs of some of the pages out of P66, and we read it together as a class. So they're not just reading John, they're reading one of the very earliest copies of John we have. And here's the other thing that's remarkable about P66. P66 doesn't just have almost all the gospel, it has the very first page. It has the prologue, every word of it. In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. One of the things that we learn about ancient manuscripts in the early Christian world is this isn't something that, this would be intuitive if you think about it, is when a manuscript gets damaged, okay, and it's in the form of a book, a codex. When an ancient book gets damaged, what pages are lost first? The beginning and the end, right? It's common because those are the outer pages. Think about it. If you have a book you like to take around in your backpack and you stuff it in your backpack and take it out of your backpack, 50 times a year, what pages do you lose first? Not the middle pages. You lose the pages at the beginning or the pages at the end. So a lot of the copies we have of our Gospels are missing the beginning and the end naturally, right? That's not surprising. But this manuscript has the opening page. It's amazing. Every year when my students read it with me, their response is always the same because we're done reading it and they're like, this is exactly the same Greek as it is in our Bibles now. And I'm like, yeah, that's kind of the point. It hasn't substantively changed. It's the same exact thing. And if you were to read it, you would be like, wow, this is from 200 AD and is substantively identical. So, what we have in the New Testament is not only 5,700 manuscripts, but many which are early. Now, many which are late, too. The vast majority of our manuscripts are medieval, don't mistake, because that's where the scriptorium's cranked up. We have a lot of manuscripts from the 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th century, okay, of course. We would expect that because those are more recent, and that's when we produce a lot of these. But the fact that we can reach as far back as the 2nd is stunning. By the way, you may not realize that the oldest New Testament manuscript we have is also a copy of the Gospel of John, and it's what's known as Papyrus 52. P52 is still considered the earliest copy of any New Testament book, and dated right around 125 AD, but usually the dating goes in 50-year increments, so it's roughly dated 100 to 150, and was discovered in Egypt, even though John was written in Ephesus. What's interesting about P52 is, if you think about it, let's say John was written in 90 AD, which is a pretty reasonable date, and P52 is written between 100 and 150. Now you've got a document that's maybe within 25 years of its original production, or maybe 50 years of its original production. I don't know of any document of antiquity that gives you a glimpse of a text that early, close to when it was written. If you're ever traveling in the UK and you get near Manchester, England, you can go see P52. It's in what's called the John Rylands Library at the University of Manchester. You can go in there and you can look at it. It's like now a tourist attraction. They've kind of made a big deal of it, so that if you go to the John Rylands little bookstore at the end, there's all these little postcards with an image of P52 on it that you can send home to your friends. Look what I saw, P52, right? And you can hang it on the wall or put it on your fridge or whatever. But it's a big tourist attraction because it's still the earliest New Testament text we have. So this is something that maybe you want to do next time you're there. What's the point? Here's the point, is that now that we have a lot of manuscripts, more than any other document in antiquity, we have the earliest glimpse. We can get all the way back to the 2nd century, and when we get back to the 2nd century, the text looks substantively the same as it does now. All right, that leads us to the third and final thing I want to talk about here, which is the quality of the manuscripts. We talked about quantity, we talked about date, and now we're going to talk about quality. A couple different things I want to explore into this last heading. First is, let's talk about those changes again, 200 to 400,000. Let's assume those numbers are accurate, and I don't have any reason to doubt them. I already gave you a reason to think those numbers don't nearly mean what you think they do, by virtue of the fact that we only know that many variants because we have so many manuscripts, more than any other document. So in one sense, that number is somewhat meaningless because it's only inflated by virtue of how successful we are in acquiring New Testament manuscripts. But there's another reason why that number is not that meaningful, because of the kind of variance. When someone talks about variance, we tend to get really nervous. We think, oh my gosh, this is a different story. This is a different account. This is a different Jesus. In one gospel, Jesus rises from the dead, and the other one he doesn't, or something like this. Right? We're talking about, so we think massive changes. But actually, that's not the case. What makes up the vast, vast majority of these 200,000 plus changes? When I say vast majority, I'm talking about upwards of 75 or 80% of all textual variants. We know that almost all these textual variants are basically accounted for as spelling mistakes. Changes in what's called orthography in the ancient world. So orthography is just a fancy word for differences of spelling. And by the way, not just spelling mistakes, because scribes did make spelling mistakes, but spelling variations. It's very common to have spelling variations in the ancient world. So can you imagine that a massive chunk of these textual variations is not only accounted for by the number of manuscripts, but also by the fact that almost all of them, and about 75 or 80% of them, are basically spelling differences, all of which count as a textual variant in the manuscript tradition. I don't know if you've thought much about a spelling variation, but spelling variations sometimes can affect the text meaningfully, but most of the time you don't even notice they're there. And most of the time when you have a spelling variation, you actually fix it in your head intuitively. This is why when my students proofread their papers, even with spell check, I always get spelling errors. Like, how is this happening? Because when they proofread it, I don't know how they missed the spell check thing, but when they proofread it, they just intuitively fix it in their minds, which is why you always need someone else to proof your paper, right? Because you know what's coming in a sense and you don't see it on the way. But no one looks at a spelling mistake and then thinks the whole thing is rubbish as a result. I'll give you an example of this that I think brings this home. Years ago, back when my kids were younger, they're all out of the house now, but back when my kids were younger, I would do the traditional go into the bedroom and tuck them in at night scenario. So one night I went into my son's room to say goodnight. And all my kids are avid readers, and my son was in the middle of this book. And he goes, Dad, I found a spelling mistake in this book. And I'm thinking to myself, no, you didn't. And he's like, no, I did. And this book is one of the best-selling books in all of the history of the English-speaking world. Maybe hundreds of millions of copies have been sold of this book. And he's reading this book, and I'm thinking to myself, in my back, I didn't say this out loud, I'm thinking in the back of my head, do you know how many times editors have been over this book? You know how many print runs this book has had? You know how many times this thing has been on the shelf? There's no way in the world you found a spelling error. So I said, let me see it. I was getting ready to tell my 12-year-old, whatever he was at the time, see, it's not a spelling error. You know what? He was right. He found a mistake in this book. Looking back on it now, I kind of wish we had written to the editor or the publisher saying, hey, should we get like an award for this or something? Some sticker, some free book, some, cup of coffee, I don't know, give it something here. Because that was like, wow, this thing is really an error. And I can't remember if it was like there versus there. You know how it could be T-H-E-I-R versus T-H-E-R-E versus T-H-E-Y apostrophe R-E. Maybe it was something like that. It was a legitimate mistake. And I told my son, I was like, well done, And then I took the book and threw it in the trash and said, now you don't know anything about what it says. No, that's not what I did, right? Because one spelling error, even lots of spelling errors, doesn't change the meaning of the story. You don't look at a story and say, well, if there's a spelling mistake, well, then I can't know what it says. Here's what you realize, and it's not just spelling mistakes. In my book, Heresy of Orthodoxy, which I guess I heard maybe some people had read here, I have a whole chapter on this where I talk about how it's not just spelling variations. There's also different aspects of the way Greek works that you can have variations that don't change the meaning at all. And a lot of these things are bound up in that. What that means is that when you whittle all the sort of meaningful and viable variants down, we're talking about a 1 of 1% here of even worthy of discussion. So what looked like this massive, scary hundreds of thousands of variants technically is true. They're there. But what's not true is whether they actually change anything and whether they actually challenge the viability of the New Testament. But there's more to say about quality than this. Here's the other thing you may not realize about the quality of our New Testament manuscripts is there's lots of evidence for very professional book production. I've also written on this in other places, and I can't say it all tonight, but let me mention a number of things that scholars have begun to discover about the early Christian manuscripts that have really been encouraging. One is what we call the scribal hand, the handwriting itself. It used to be thought that Christian scribes are kind of lousy at their job and didn't do a very good job. Well, that's before we started discovering a lot of Christian manuscripts. But once we just started discovering more and more Christian manuscripts, we realized, wait a second, these are really impressive pieces of work. They're calligraphic, they're beautiful, they're formal, clearly done by a professional scribe. So the scribal hands of a lot of these manuscripts is actually quite impressive. Here's a second thing to note about the quality of our Christian scribes, is they all adopted the same book format in a surprising way. One of the things that you may not realize is that when Christianity was born in the ancient world, everybody that was writing literary works were all using what was called a scroll, okay, or what we call a roll. A roll is what you see where you wind up each end of the book and you only have writing on one side of the page. And so the Jews were using rolls, the Greco-Roman world was using rolls, everybody was using rolls. And then along comes this upstart thing called Christianity. You know what they do? They don't use rolls. Like, what? They use what's called a codex. What's a codex? It's where you fold the page in half and you bind it at the spine. You can read on both sides of the page now rather than just on one side of the page. By the way, every time you open your Bibles, guess what you're opening? A codex. Talk about winning the world. The codex took over the whole world in such a way that basically everybody uses the codex and will never stop. It is the ultimate book production format. In fact, it was so dominant in the early Christian world that it used to be thought that Christians invented the codex. Did you know that? Early scholars thought, this is so amazing. Christians are using the codex earlier than anyone else. They're using it all over the place. They're using it ubiquitously. They must have invented it. Well, it turns out they didn't invent it. But here's what's amazing about it. In spite of their Jewish heritage and their Greco-Roman heritage, they said, we're going to use our own distinctive book format. This has been a stump for scholars. They're like, what can explain this amazing thing that Christians are doing? So countercultural in every way. Lots of theories out there that can try to explain why Christians preferred the codex. Before I even mention what those might be, though, the observation I want to point out to you is the fact that they were so uniformly doing it everywhere. In fact, it's so dominant, we can hardly find a single copy of the New Testament anywhere across our 5,700 that's not on a codex. All the second century ones on codices, as far back as we can see. Every geographical location, all over the place, is codex, codex, codex. So what I always ask is, did someone send out a memo? How do you do that? How do you get every Christian doing the same thing? This is remarkable unity. This suggests a very sophisticated and networked scribal infrastructure, okay? So you have very good scribal hand with a very networked and developed scribal infrastructure. This suggests that Christian scribes are not flying by the seat of their pants going, I don't know what to do. I don't know how to do these things. I don't know how to read. No, they seem to actually know what they're doing, and we have every reason to think they did a really good job of it. Here's a third thing I'll mention about Christian scribes, is that they would correct their work. One of the things about that document P66 that I mentioned a minute ago that my students read is that the first scribe would come in and write the text, and then what looks like another scribe would go in as a corrector and proof it. And when they would proof the text, sometimes they would catch mistakes that the first scribe had. So scribes were very meticulous about their work, very careful, very conscientious. And they would go back and correct the work and make sure it was right, and they would go over it meticulously. This suggests probably an early version of what's called a scriptorium, right, which is an official scribal sort of place where copying happens at a very developed and intentional level. This sort of write a book and then check a book and correct a book is the kind of thing you want to be happening when you want to know that those books are copied carefully. By the way, the job of the scribe was so brutally hard in the ancient world. I don't know if you know this, but as in a lot of the manuscripts we have, the scribes would make marginal comments in the margins that would just kind of random, that you could tell were made sort of like just off, kind of like you would doodle on your bulletin at church. And they would never do that, of course, never doodle on the bulletin, but you'd write on the bulletin. Well, scribes would do that. Every once in a while they would write up something like, my back hurts, I'm getting tired. The scribal job was hard. And then scribes would sometimes talk back and forth to each other in the margins. So one scribe would do something, and another scribe would say, stop changing the text. And they would sort of say stuff. You can tell there's a system here. They're talking to each other. They're interacting with each other. If you wanted to be a scribe in the ancient world, that was brutal. It was tough on the eyes. We don't have the glasses and reading glasses. It was tough with the pen. It was backbreaking work for thousands of words that you'd have to copy over time. When you look at the collective work of our scribes, it is stunning how incredibly good a job they do. Does that mean every individual manuscript's good? No, we have some manuscripts that are lousy. That scribe is just not a good scribe. Fair enough. When you have thousands of manuscripts and thousands of scribes, you're going to come across some bad ones. But the collective witness of our manuscripts is incredibly solid. Okay? And as a whole, our scribal infrastructure was sophisticated and professional. Okay, so where does that leave us? We've talked about three things. Quantity of the manuscripts. We have more than any other document in the ancient world. It's not even close, which means that we know the original text is in there, and we can compare these copies, and that explains why we have so many variants. The date of the manuscripts. There's no other document from the first century that gives you a glimpse of the text in the second century. Are you kidding me? Nothing gets you that close, and when you look at it, it's remarkably consistent. And then the quality of the manuscripts. Most of the changes are either spelling variations or other changes that don't affect the meaning of the text. And we have a lot of evidence for a sophisticated scribal infrastructure, including the scribal hands, the codex book format, and possible evidence of early scriptoriums. So much more to say. I just released a book. This one's not going to make it on your shelf probably, but I just released a book this past summer with Oxford University Press on early Christian manuscripts. And it's actually on early Christian miniature manuscripts called miniature codices. In case you're wondering, how to get a copy, let me just tell you, it's $110 a copy. Ouch, right? Oxford, when it sells its academic books, does not go easy on you, and it's not made for sort of popular consumption. Basically, they sell it to major research libraries and a few scholars, and everyone else just looks at it online. Okay, fair enough. But in that book, when I wrote it, I was just stunned again at how textually oriented the early Christian world was. These were not amateurs. These people knew about books, they understood books, and they did a good job of copying their books. Okay, let me open up here for Q&A. I said I would do that for paper number 2 or session number 2. We do welcome you just to raise your hand, speak loud, and I'll repeat it for the microphone for the recording. Yep, right here. Okay, I figured this would be the first question. So the question was, can I comment on the 2 significant textual variants we know about in the New Testament, which would be the long ending of Mark 16, 9 through 20, and what's known as the story of Jesus and the adulterous woman, which is the end of Mark 7 and end of John 7 and the beginning of John 8. So one of the things that's interesting about misquoting Jesus is that, so rather than talk about how the vast majority of textual variants are spelling errors, Ehrman spends a ton of time on these two texts. And it's not surprising why, because they're famous and also because they're longer and it's easy to rattle people's cages with these sorts of examples. A couple of things to note about those textual variants. One is those are the only two sizable textual variants in the entire New Testament textual witness. So when you think about how many books, how many stories, how many texts, and how many copies, if you say what are some meaningfully sized textual variants, you have a grand total of 2, which is the longing of Mark and the story of Jesus and the adulterous woman, which is a pretty good track record. Aside from that, we actually have really good evidence about these textual variants and why we know they're not there in the original manuscripts. You may wonder why they still appear in many of our English Bibles. If you have an English Bible, they'll appear in brackets, and usually it'll say something like our earliest manuscripts don't have these copies. Part of the reason they're in most English Bibles now has to do with the history of the King James Version, which dominated the English-speaking world for so long, that leaving these out now is probably something most publishers aren't going to do, so they stick it in there and they leave it in brackets. But there's really good evidence that these were not original. And here's the thing that I always remind people of. If you know they're not original, then the change doesn't change the reliability of the New Testament text. Like if someone made a big change, but I can spot it, well, it doesn't matter how big the change is. The fact is, I can spot it. If I can spot it, I can get us back to the original text, right? What would be concerning is if we had a big change and couldn't spot it. Then we'd be like, well, now I have a big change and I didn't know it was a big change. Okay? But if I can see someone did a change somewhere, but I can see that it happened, then I think it takes away the concern one might have over it. If you want more on this, I wrote an article for Ligonier Ministries Table Talk magazine years ago, where the whole article was about the story of Jesus and the adulterous woman and the longing of Mark. And I talk about those stories, why we don't think they're original, and what impact it has on things like inerrancy. Great question, normal question. Yeah, right here.
Yeah, looking to what you're covering this evening.
Yeah.
My question is, what you are presenting, is that addressing the veracity, for example, of the New Testament in this day and age? And what is your observation, looking at Christian institutions specifically, in actually accepting that into the veracity, how it flows then to the seminaries, and what is being preached from the pulpits to this day and age?
All right, so if I understood your question, I'll repeat it for the recording. You're asking, okay, we're making a case tonight for the trustworthiness of the Bible. Is that still being upheld in major Christian schools and seminaries? Is that essentially your question?
Essentially, yes.
Yeah,
And then
okay.
flowing down to the pulpits.
Yeah, well, yeah, and if it's not being held up there, yeah. So I think there's good news and bad news here. Whenever I say, if there's good news and bad news, which do you want first? It's always, well, give me the bad news first, right? So the bad news is that there are pockets, and in some places substantive pockets of institutions, seminaries or colleges that have Christian heritages, Christian names, that are not sticking with the historic view of Scripture as inspired and inerrant. That's true. And is that affecting denominations in pulpit preaching? Absolutely. And so we know certain denominations, we can see trends and slides and directions that we would probably be concerned about. And that's not new. That's old. There's the 20th century sort of, early 20th century sort of fundamentalist controversy, which that term isn't what you think it means. But it was basically a debate over some of these things that hasn't really ended. And a lot of the main denominational changes have been around exactly these things. So that's still going on, and it is a concern, and that's certainly not good news, but there's lots of good news. And when I say lots of good news, what I mean is when I look at the evangelical landscape across the United States, and really even globally, at least in the English-speaking world, which I'm more up to speed on, obviously, I'm actually really encouraged by a number of solid institutions that are growing, that are cranking out good men and women who love God's word and uphold these things and teach these things faithfully. And I think you've seen a good resurgence of some of this in certain quarters. I think preaching is as respected now as it's been in a while. I think there's probably really good reasons to think that the book publishing side of evangelicalism is as strong as it's been in a while. So I think there's a lot of reasons to take heart. And so be encouraged by some good trends. Pray for the trends that aren't good. But I think, no matter where you are in history, is always kind of a mixed bag out there. And so you always got to be aware, okay, if I want to go to a seminary or Bible college, let me make sure I'm going to one that teaches what I think it's teaching. That would be a good piece of advice I think I would give anyone who thinks about those places. Great question. Yeah, over here.
With respect to the manuscript commission, you said, we have extant copies that are second century. I know every once in a while there's I think maybe 10 years ago or 15 years ago with P137 or something that purports to be from the first century. So I guess, is there, specifically related to that text in the first place, and then second, just more generally, is there besides the rhetorical flourish or impact of having such a manuscript, are there any viable candidates that can stretch back that far?
Yeah, so you obviously have been doing your reading there. If you didn't catch the question, he's asking, okay, look, we're talking about manuscripts and dating. What about manuscripts like P137 that was purported to be a first century manuscript and turned out not to be? I'll give you that story in a second. And then do we have any other viable, possible first century manuscripts? So first, just a general comment on manuscripts from the first century. Obviously, if you have documents written in the first century, it would be a dream of dreams to find a manuscript from the first century of any New Testament text. I mean, I can't tell you how incredible and crazy early that would be. That's such a dream thing that the chances are just so low that we would ever find it. But it's possible. It could happen, right? You never know what you're going to find in the sands of wherever. So it's certainly possible. Do I think we'll ever find a first century manuscript of any New Testament text? No, because I think that the way manuscripts survival rates are, the fact that we find anything in the second is stunning. The fact that we find anything in the first century is probably very unlikely. Do we have any current candidates that are maybe first century manuscripts? No. Do I expect to find any, as I said? Probably no. He did mention the story of Papyrus 137, which wasn't called 137 at the time. That only got the Gregory Alon number in recent times. But a number of years ago, it was mentioned that we may have a first century copy of Mark. And this made the rounds on the internet and on social media and in some public speaking engagements where people had mentioned it. And so it began sort of the rumor mill of we might have a first century Mark. And the people who were telling us that we had a first century Mark said we have good grounds for thinking it's first century from very highly respected papyrologists. Well, the unfortunate way of releasing that information like that is it gets everyone all sort of churned up about it. And they're like, oh, finally we got a first century manuscript. And then guess what? When it was finally published, you think it was first century? No, it was third century. And what looked like a wonderful sort of grab of new evidence just kind of evaporated in your hands. So what's the lesson there? I think the lesson there is, wait till the publication comes out to say anything about it, till you know what you know, and you don't know what you think you know until you know it. That would certainly be part of the application. The other part of the application is I don't think we should get too worked up about early texts. The truth of the New Testament does not hinge on finding a first century manuscript. It just doesn't. We have so much good evidence right now. We don't, in a quote, need anything else to be sure that what we have is trustworthy. Would I like a first century manuscript? In principle, well, who wouldn't? But I think one of the dangers of apologetics is that we can sort of grab a hold of things in ways that maybe always aren't consistent with the historical data, and it makes us look a little desperate. Like, oh, if we only had that, if the Shroud of Turin was only original, if the ossuary of James is really his bone box, and then you give the impression that once you get all that, and then you have grounds for believing. No, we already have it. We have tons of reasons to believe. We don't need those things to be valid in order to believe. Whether they're valid or not is interesting to debate, and you can debate those things, but we don't need that. So that's my quick take on Papyrus 137, which I think is an interesting story. And I'm glad that we have it, though, because it's still one of the earliest complete copies, or not complete, one of the earliest fragments of Mark we have, late 2nd, early 3rd century. Yes?
I believe there are some Christian scholars, theologians, who would argue that just like we have a closed canon, we have a closed manuscript tradition. There's a received text, and we should keep looking for, the critical text that is closer to the original. Can you briefly kind of say, is there any basis to why they think that, and then respond to it?
Yeah, great question. So this question has to do with what's called the Textus Receptus. You didn't use that term, use the English version of it, received text. So there's a movement within evangelicalism that some of you may know about that argues that when it comes to establishing the original text of the New Testament, that rather than looking at the earliest manuscripts that we can find to work our way back to the original text, the better way is to look at the church's broad reception of a Greek text at one moment in time and treat that reception of that text at one moment in time as a definitive church move that says, yes, we recognize this is the God-given text. If you're wondering, well, what time would that be where the church did that? Well, the Textus Receptus people take that as the early 17th century or late 16th century. So basically late 1500s, early 1600s. The King James was published, of course, but the King James has an underlying Greek text known as the Textus Receptus, the received text in English, and it was seen by many as sort of the definitive moment where the Greek text could be seen and grabbed and affirmed. And they think, why are we still tinkering with it when we have that great text then? Why do we have to still look for early manuscripts and so forth? So that movement's out there, and so it has different names. Some call it a King James only movement, which really has to do with more about the Textus Receptus than the King James English translation. I think if you ask why I'm not convinced by that, I think part of it is probably self-evident in the way I've described the view, which is when we ask what moment of frozen time do I take a Greek text and say that's the one that God has for us? Well, the only reason I would freeze it in 1610 is if I thought something happened in 1610 that made me think that was the moment. But I don't know anything in 1610 that makes me think that, and certainly unless we're Roman Catholic, we don't think the church makes some infallible declaration about the text, so that certainly isn't there available to us. What text am I looking for as an evangelical? I'm looking for the original text. I want to know what John wrote when John wrote. If John's inspired, I care what John wrote. If Mark was inspired, I care what Mark wrote. So I don't really want to know what 16th century people necessarily thought, although that's a piece of the puzzle. I want to know what those authors originally wrote when they penned it under the inspiration of the Spirit. How do I assess that? I think the best way to assess that is look at the collective manuscript evidence that gives us the best glimpse we can of the first century state of the first century text, and that I think is what we have now in the critical Greek editions. Long answer, I know, a long debate. If you want something more on this debate, you can read the King James Only Controversy by James White, which is a good summary of the debate, and I think he does a good job for explaining why he doesn't take the Textus Receptus as the sort of ultimate moment in time when the Greek text is solidified. All right, maybe one more question as we wrap up the night. Yes?
Can you address deconstructing Christianity? That seems to be the contemporary term in terms of almost relativizing everything based on a plain head of an individual's knowledge standing on their soapbox and then rewriting the Bible basically and the tenets from their own perspective in an age of individualism.
Yeah. So for the recording, the question was about the whole trend of deconstruction, and I'll add another term, deconversion, that's happening today in the church, and what do I make of that in terms of, how does that exemplify sort of people's individualistic tendencies and so on. So I think the way to answer that is to distinguish between two different kinds of deconstruction. And I actually have written about this on my website. This is a sidebar. I have a website. If you want to read more on canon and text and reliability stuff in sort of bite-sized chunks, I've created a website many years ago for this. My wife Melissa told me, she goes, hey, love that you're writing these books, but not everyone's going to want to read your books. And I'm like, okay. Our joke in the family, if you don't know my wife Melissa, she's written more books than I have. Our joke in the family is that I write books and she writes books that people read. Okay, so, but she goes, but if you want to get this stuff out in bite-sized chunks, then you need to put it out in bite-sized. So I started my website. It's called Canon Fodder, which, by the way, is a pun, C-A-N-O-N, right? Not C-A-N-N-O-N. Of course, you have to explain puns. They're not funny anymore. But Canon Fodder is the name of the website. I have a bunch of stuff on there, and I've written about this there. But two different kinds of deconstruction. One bad, one good. Some people find themselves in I'll start with the good. Some people find themselves in Christian spaces where they realize this is not a healthy Christian space, okay? And there's some, and I'm not talking right versus left here. Whether you can be unhealthy on the right, unhealthy on the left, where there's stuff happening that's unethical or bad, or certain versions of Christianity that have unhealthy trends. And one version of deconstruction that I think is fun is people realizing I've seen parts of evangelicalism that need to be reformed. Parts of evangelicalism need to be thought through better. We need to do better on X or do better on Y. And there's room for any part of Christ Church to always ask, hey, where's the log in my eye? Where can we do better as a church? If I were to ask everybody in this room tonight, you look at evangelicalism in America, where are we strong, where are we weak? What do we need to do better? So the good part of deconstruction is saying, there's some blind spots we have as evangelicals, let's do better. Sometimes people use the term deconstruction for that. I don't really think that's the best term for it, okay? I think, but that's effectively what Martin Luther did. He looked at the church and go, guys, this is a mess. And everyone wagged their finger at Luther and said, you hate the church. And Luther's like, no, I love the church. That's why I'm bringing up the problems. I want it to change, okay? So next time someone critiques the church and you say, well, you must hate the church, remember, Luther did that. The issue isn't whether you critique the church. The issue is whether your critique is accurate, okay? So that's the thing to keep in mind. Now, on to the bad deconstruction. The bad deconstruction, I think, was the main tenor of your question, is there some people that basically have deconverted away from Christianity or have changed their definition of Christianity so much that it's not Christianity anymore, okay? And they basically are saying, Christianity doesn't make sense, Christianity is incoherent, Christianity is bad, and so I've got to change it or abandon it or sort of show its holes and weaknesses as invalid as a system. That is all over the place today, and what we have is a lot of people who used to be evangelicals deconvert out of evangelicalism and then spend their whole career critiquing evangelicalism. And there's people on the internet do this. There's people who have whole lives now set up as ex-evangelicals. That's the term, right? Where I'm gonna sort of point out everything that I don't like about evangelicalism. I think that's obviously a very disturbing trend. I think it probably says a lot about their own background that they can't just move on. They have to make a whole career out of attacking Christianity. Does that speak to sort of a culture that's obsessed with individualistic takes on things and so forth? Probably, but that's not new. We've always been a culture of individualism, so that's hardly a new phenomenon. But it's just a more public phenomenon now. When people deconvert 20 years ago, you just didn't hear about it. Because 20 years ago, there was no mechanism to push out their deconversion message. Now there is. So we just have to deal with it more. All that said, though, about the negativity of that, and it is negative, we probably need to do a better job of interacting with people who are deconverting and trying to listen to their story, understand what things they may bring up that have some validity to them, and then try to compassionately persuade them of the truth of Christianity again. So it's tricky, but that's obviously a negative trend, and we'd want to be very careful about it. But I think there's a positive version out there too. Okay, that's probably up to the bottom of the clock. Thank you, everyone. Sunday school's at 8:45. Okay, maybe I'll see you in the morning. Thank you. All right.